Made possible through support from ARC Thrift Stores, Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, Developmental Pathways, the Limbaugh Law Firm, and the ARC of Aurora. A THINK+change training.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us here today for another episode in a multi-part series that we are hosting here through THINK+change, all about trauma and developmental disability. I'm your host, Erica Dennison, and I am here with a special guest today where we're going to be having an episode talking all about how trauma affects the brain. Throughout this process, we'll be asking a series of questions and just having a really casual conversational chat about kind of what this looks like. So for my special guest, if you could do me a favor and introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners and share with them a little bit about your work when it comes to trauma.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Brian Tallant, and I'm a licensed professional counselor and also a program administrator at Rocky Mountain Human Services in Denver, Colorado, called the Denver START program, which is a mental health crisis and program for individuals who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. I have worked in the field of mental health, specifically working with people who have intellectual and developmental disabilities for about 25 years in the Denver metro area. And I'm a contributing member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's IDD expert panel. And I sit on the board of directors for an organization called NADD, which is the National Association for the Dually Diagnosed.
You are a busy human.
Yeah, a lot going on.
You have a lot going on. Yeah. But oh my gosh, like what a tenure of experience that you have when it comes to this important work.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it has been a very passionate career, yeah. And with something I'm very excited to still be a part of.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the good work that you're doing within our local community.
Yeah,
it sounds like you've probably made an impact in the lives of many humans.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes,
I know they've had an impact on me.
Oh,
so.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So when we're kind of starting this first episode, I think a really important thing to talk about is what is trauma? Can you share with me a little bit about what that is via your perspective?
Yeah, I think in simplest terms, trauma is events that threaten a person's life or threaten their safety, their physical safety, and or threatens the physical safety and the life of those that are very close or dear to them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty much it in simplistic terms, is that trauma are those events that basically threaten a person's life and their feelings of safety.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So as a couple examples, would you say maybe a natural disaster or a life-threatening emergency, fire, hurricane, injury, bullying, would all of that be considered possibly a trauma?
Absolutely. Car accidents, assaults. It comes in a lot of different forms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think kind of even reflecting on my own personal experience, I mean, I certainly have experienced trauma in my life. I'm sure you have too. I think anyone who's probably listening or viewing to this has something that may have happened to them within their life that is just a very standstill moment, I suppose, that probably resonates with them in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely. And, if you get through life without having a traumatic event, then you're pretty lucky. Yeah. I think that it's kind of an unfortunate part of the human experience. Mm-hmm. But obviously, some people experience a lot more of those traumatic events than others.
Yeah, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think when I'm, within our work, this is a podcast via THINK+change, which is a social enterprise at the ARC of Aurora. The ARC of Aurora is a not-for-profit advocacy organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I even think about those that we serve and support and advocate on behalf of. And many of them have experienced some types of trauma in their life. People with disabilities are statistically higher to be victims of, mistreatment, abuse, neglect, exploitation than maybe someone without a disability. I think that is also another trauma. So, I mean, I really appreciate you kind of breaking that down for people, because definitely I could see how it could be a little confusing.
Yeah, when I first got into the field of mental health for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, one of the things that became very clear early on in my career is that probably the number one mental health condition that we were treating was post-traumatic stress. And unfortunately, I think that I often talk about what I do is not a clinical expertise, it's a cultural competency. And one of the things that's unfortunate is that trauma, unfortunately, is interwoven in the culture of disability, which, because the research is very clear that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experience anywhere from 2 to 10-fold the traumatic events of people without disabilities.
Wow.
So it's very significant for the population.
Ugh, and that's why it's so important that we have people like you in the universe, kind of doing the work that you're doing. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when we're talking about trauma, how would you say trauma affects the brain?
So the trauma affects the brain in different ways. You have people who have discrete episodes of trauma. This is like examples where, somebody who has been in a natural disaster, or they've experienced a car wreck, or they've experienced a physical or sexual assault. Those are discrete episodes, and it affects the brain by encoding in the brain those experiences through sensory. It's sensory coding. In other words, things that you see, things that you hear, smell, feel, touch, taste, all of those are encoded in the brain in a way that it develops neural pathways that are very, very salient. That if you see anything or hear or smell or taste things that remind you of those episodes, it automatically triggers their neural pathways that go to what's called our limbic system, which controls our fight or flight response, which is our survival response, right? And so people who experience discrete episodes will have those neural pathways that are directly into their fight or flight response, and those are very salient. They last a long time. So it's a safety, so that if you get some reminiscent of that traumatic event, your brain says you need to be careful, you need to be aware, you've been in this situation before, so you need to be immediately going into that fight or flight and survival mode.
Wow.
So that's one way that it affects the brain. Another way that it affects the brain is in brain development, which I think is also so in talking about Bruce Perry's Dr. Bruce Perry, who is a famous psychologist who talks about neurosequential brain development in relation to trauma. The brain, when trauma happens during brain development, for even going back as far as in utero, if you were to talk about trauma that happens in utero in terms of maybe exposure, malnutrition, things like that. I mean, you can even argue that that's trauma. But when an infant experiences or a toddler experiences trauma through that developmental period while the brain is in development, then it actually affects the development of the brain. We know that through Bruce Perry's research that if an infant or a child experiences early onset of abuse and neglect and prolonged abuse and neglect during that period of time, those children can have lower brain weights and less fissures in the brain. So it physically alters the brain and its development. So, which obviously has a significant impact on that individual, and also you can see that relationship then to early onset of abuse, neglect, and potential disabilities down the road, both emotional as well as developmental.
Wow, that's so significant. And I think a lot of times, I experienced a trauma as a teenager where I was pretty viciously attacked by an animal, and every time I see that animal now, I kind of have this this response, right?
Absolutely.
But I think a lot of times I wouldn't say a lot of people would consciously think of in utero as perhaps like fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, right? Like if a mother uses while she's pregnant, I wonder if people would consider that a trauma, just like initially thinking about that. So I appreciate you talking about this in utero. I mean, even when you're like having your development as a really young child.
Yeah, since we know that especially repeated trauma affects brain development, when we naturally go, well, the brain develops as early as before a child is born. So so that's really, I think, the first time that we started thinking about trauma in terms of prenatal is that it's relevant in terms of brain development.
Absolutely. I appreciate the breakdown when it comes to how trauma affects the brain. So my next question would be for you is, can the brain heal from trauma?
Absolutely, it can. And one of the things that is really significant to understand is that, the brain does, those neural pathways never stop developing, right? I mean, the really cool thing is that people do spontaneously recover from trauma. Those pathways are formed, but we also continue to learn and we develop new pathways. And so you can relearn some of those experiences. You can have things that remind you of that traumatic event, that activate those neural pathways that were developed during that traumatic event. But then you can have different experiences with that stimuli. And so then you can be basically reconditioned and form neural pathways that say, not always this, whatever this thing is, like the animal that you saw.
Right.
You can start to have more and more experiences with those animals where you go, oh, that's less, that traumatic event then becomes less and less salient, and you form no new neural pathways with those experiences with those animals. So it's what we call brain plasticity.
Okay.
And so it's a really good thing, especially in children. It's, as that brain is still developing, there's so much more opportunity for plasticity and change, and basically in a lot of ways relearning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think about even like early childhood development. I mean, many people know that, early intervention and, helping a kiddo, reach all these developmental milestones is so important. But then I think about, if they experience a trauma, or even say, for example, a kiddo needs to go to foster care because their family of origin can no longer care for them for whatever reason. I mean, that certainly could be a traumatic event that affects them early on in their development.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really significant too that I think came out of Bruce Perry's research is understanding, we understand trauma and then its relationship to brain development. But then what we also know about brain development is it's also, importantly related to attachment. And so we never did think about, and many years ago there was a famous study of Russian orphans who were in an orphanage where they didn't get the physical contact and the nurturing, the coddling, the things that infants need during brain development to form healthy attachment.
Sure.
And so we started to recognize that there's a direct relationship between what we call complex trauma, which are individuals who experience that early onset of abuse and neglect during that period of brain development. It's complex trauma, and its relationship to attachment and what happens in terms of disorganized attachment, so that if we don't get those early messages about safety and coddling and nurturing and get your needs met, then we see disorganized attachment in relationship to complex trauma. So
Wow.
they kind of go hand in hand for individuals who experience that kind of trauma during brain development.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I'm getting I like to call them goosebumps, while you're talking about this stuff, because it really is incredibly impactful, thinking about a kiddo growing up on how even these just people may view them as, I guess, like minor things, but they actually are very impactful to development for these kids.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that information. You talked a little bit about, his name was Dr. Perry, correct? And you mentioned the Neurosequential Model. Might you share a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, absolutely. What we know about brain development, and not just in humans, but in all animals, the brain starts from the most basic function. When infants start off with having a well-developed brain stem, which is the back of the brain, that controls things, autonomic brain functions such as breathing, heart rate, core body temperature, those things that really are essential for physical body survival, right?
Sure.
And then the next parts of the brain that start to develop, and it's sequential. So that part of the brain develops first. The next part is then kind of our emotional state, and that what's called our limbic system, our hypothalamus, which has a lot to do with our fight or flight response. These are survival areas that are connected to emotion and also connected to body function. So when we go into fight or flight, there's physiological changes that happen in the body. We basically move resources from one place to the other, and it's in order to get our body ready to run. They should call it the flight or fight response, because what it's doing is get your body ready to run, and fighting is what you do when you can't run anymore,
right?
Basically. So
right.
I think they got that reversed, but so that's the part of the brain that develops next, and then we start to, and then the next parts of the brain that develop are those around communication and about and the frontal lobe and the frontal cortex of the brain, which has to do with forethought and planning and anticipating consequences and problem solving and those things that are higher level brain functions. And so, so you understand that when you have any sort of trauma or abuse or neglect, it starts to impact the brain development in that sequence. So, I could give an example, I guess, is that what I've recognized is that when an infant or a child, if they're not getting their needs met, if they experience that early onset of abuse and neglect, then that while they're developing that fight or flight response on that hypothalamus, it becomes overactive, basically.
Oh.
And what happens is it's kind of like a muscle in some ways, and then that's becoming overdeveloped while there's impairment then of the frontal lobe that has to do with all of that forethought planning. And so, basically what you end up with is a person who is neurologically hardwired to be activated in that fight or flight response at the first sign of any sort of stress. And then there's an underdevelopment of that area of the brain that has to do with problem solving and forethought planning and that higher level function and communication. So what we recognize is that, there's different stages of brain development that get interfered with by specific traumas. And then that can tell us what the needs are of the person when we're especially talking about trauma treatment. Then we can assess and take a look at where in those areas were the brain development affected, and then what can we do as a result of that in order to support that individual.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Our bodies are sure are complicated, aren't they?
Yeah. The brain in particular, that's for sure.
No kidding. But it keeps us going every day.
Yeah, it does. Yep.
I have one final question for this particular episode. Within our work, we directly work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And, how would you say we can support people with developmental disabilities, children and adults who have experienced trauma?
Yeah, and that's it's a great question. It's a complex question.
Sure.
I would say that I'm going to first start by talking about people who have experienced discrete episodes of trauma.
Got it.
And one of the things that we have learned is that one of the evidence-based practices that we have that we know is effective in trauma treatment is cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. And there is a particular manualized treatment called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that is specific for treating trauma. And so one of the things that we have been trying to do is, and I've been a part of with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, is developing adapted trauma-focused CBT that is appropriate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And pretty excited about the fact that I think in the next couple of months, for your listeners, if you would like to follow this, I encourage people to go to the NCTSN website. It's www.nctsn.org. You can watch for what's coming out, which is the manual for adapted trauma-focused CBT for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Oh, great.
There's a couple of other products I just want to say real quick about NCTSN, that there's a fact sheet on trauma and children with intellectual and developmental disabilities there. It's really, really a wonderful tool for educating people about the relationship between trauma and developmental disabilities, and has information about how we can support people who've experienced trauma. And also there is it's called the Road to Recovery. It's a trauma toolkit for supporting people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who've experienced trauma. And it is all you have to do is register with the NCTSN website, and you can download it for free. And it's a fantastic, it's a training manual. It has a facilitator guide and a participant guide.
Oh, great.
And people in any community who are familiar with IDD or connected with the IDD community and IDD systems can basically facilitate this training to educate their community to best support people who have disabilities and experience trauma. But I think that there's some good things that have already happened. I want to mention is that as we have moved to more of a community-based service delivery system, that we have gone through the deinstitutionalization movement, and more people are living in their community, the rates of abuse and neglect have dropped as a result of that. So the good news is that, I told you about those kind of alarming statistics that we've got in that relationship between disability and trauma.
Sure.
The good news is it's going in the other direction. So people are safer than they used to be. And so we need to continue to sort of capitalize on the improvements that we've made around making environments safe for people. When people are connected to their community, they're safer. When they're more isolated, they're more vulnerable. There's other things that we can do around things like sex education, so that people understand what are healthy boundaries. They understand when they're in unsafe situations. So there's specific training that we can provide for people. Other vulnerabilities are things like making sure that we have good, we understand trauma and we understand the effects of trauma, and we don't do something, this is probably one of the most important things, is that we don't, in the field of mental health and developmental disabilities, there's a phenomenon called diagnostic overshadowing. And what that is it's the over-attribution of mental health symptomology to a person's disability, right? And so it first was thought to be a clinical term. This is something that happens in a clinical assessment. That was a term that was developed through the NADD organization I mentioned earlier.
Sure.
But I've had conversations with folks in that organization saying, no, it's not a clinical term. Diagnostic overshadowing happens in our communities every day. Parents, educators, physicians, we have a tendency to do that, where we see mental health symptomology and we attribute it to a person's disability and say, well, that's just autism, or that's just this person's intellectual disability. No, there's nothing indicative to autism or an intellectual disability that are what I see as clearly, in a lot of cases, trauma symptoms. And so we do that. We just say, well, this person doesn't need treatment. This is just their disability. And what we've really come to understand is that, no, there's distinct symptoms of trauma, post-traumatic stress, and they are not indicative to a disability. So we're emerging from this this diagnostic overshadowing in a way to where we're understanding that, no, these people are exhibiting trauma symptoms, and we can treat those trauma symptoms. We can treat those trauma symptoms in the exact same way we do it with people who don't have disabilities.
Right.
So, it's really taking a look at what are the vulnerabilities that people with IDD have in our community, and how do we address them? How do we make people safer? How do we make them more visible? How do we listen to what they're saying? It's another vulnerability, too, is that I think that a lot of times people with IDD are considered to not be credible reporters.
Yes, I hear that a lot, unfortunately.
And so we have got to hear people's voices, and we've got to listen to them and recognize that when this person communicates this, there's a reason and there's a core.
We need to believe them.
We have to believe them.
Yeah.
And once we believe them, then we can start to support them.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of vulnerabilities. We just have to continue to take a look at those, look at the reasons why people with IDD experience higher rates of abuse and neglect, and then we got to address those vulnerabilities. Yeah.
So much more work to be done, but great work is currently being done. I mean, it's the resources that you shared. We will certainly link those in our show notes and find those for all of our viewers and listeners, because I mean, the option of like a train the trainer option that you had been talking about, I think is so helpful. I mean, I think even the greenest trainer or facilitator could probably use that, whether they have done a training or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's the tool is so easy to use.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate all these fabulous resources. As we wrap up the conversation for this particular episode, do you have any closing remarks or any last minute thoughts before we say our farewells?
I appreciate you brought to light for me just now that the fact that things are going in the right direction, and I just really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk about it, because that's really the first part, is getting the message out so that we dispel some of the myths that we have about trauma and IDD, and we can start to address them and take a look at those vulnerabilities and start keep going in the right direction.
I agree.
Yeah.
Down the correct path.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Brian, I super appreciate your valuable time today when we were here for episode 1 on how trauma affects the brain. To all of our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. Be sure to tune in for our next couple of episodes. Brian will be featured again in our next episode too. So we will see you then. But in the meantime, stay curious. Take care.
Thanks.